Yeah, well, thanks everyone for making it. I know a few folks are running late. Um, and David and I are not presently in St. Louis, so we have joined virtually. And really, this evening's meeting is really meant to be a conversation of sorts between the commission members toward establishing a set of recommendations for the report. So I think perhaps we should start first with just some updates from the report working group. Um, and then we can move into a conversation to hear from other commission members about any recommendations they want to see in the report. And then, the working group will continue to move us toward a completed report, if that sounds good to everyone else. I can no longer see everyone else. I only see another box with myself and David in it. So I don't know if we can switch back to the other view. Great, that's amazing.
Yeah,
Um,
we can see you.
yeah, we can see you now. They changed it. Okay, so yeah, so should we get started with just a report update?
Sure. Uh, I can start if you want.
That'd be great, Dr. Russ.
So the two work groups I'm working with have completed their work. The educational workforce was consisted of myself, Cameron Anglam, who's a assistant professor at St. Louis University, focusing on education, and Michelle Purdy, who's an associate professor at Washington University, who really was the chair of that section. And so we were really proud of the report. We were able to capture a lot of data, looking at the current both historical trends in public education. We decided to focus on public education, looking at historical trends in St. Louis, then looking at outcomes, both graduation rates as well as academic performance, stratified by race, which was quite striking. I think none of us would be surprised to hear of the difference, the magnitude of the difference in both graduation rates and academic performance of blacks and whites, irrespective of the grade level. Then we focus on the funding for the public schools, city funding, but obviously we have to focus on the state funding formula for the city schools, recognizing that the city schools are, even though they may appear to receive adequate funding commensurate with the overall funding formula, the financial needs are greater in a city. And therefore, it's important for us to inform the public that what appears to be parity isn't. There are greater requirements, greater needs in the public schools. So we completed that, replete with all the necessary data to corroborate that, and I think it will be fairly easy to arrive at a number of recommendations. Recommendation one, obviously, would be to restore the funding to the public schools, both the statewide funding formula, even though we're a city commission, and the city. Recommendation two really was, as you restore the funding, we have to ensure that our teachers are compensated appropriately, commensurate with the increased demands that they have as public school teachers. And then we have to actually focus on the outcomes. What's the process for really tracking these students? How do we hold our whole system responsible for these outcomes? And that means really, it doesn't mean creating a whole new a layer of bureaucracy. It means really ensuring that there is accountability at all the levels. Those were not explicit recommendations, but I think it'd be easy to glean those recommendations from that report. The other report was the Health Commission report, And the Health Commission report consisted of myself along with chaired by, hold on one second, chaired by Dr. Maddie Davis, who is the director of the city health department, as well as Sydney Watson, who is a professor at St. Louis University School of Medicine, and forgive me, I was rushing, so I didn't get all the people here, but I should have it by memory. Daryl Hudson, who is a associate professor at the Brown School of Social Work, who's actually going to is leaving, going to another institution. And so, sorry, one other person I'll remember. I'll have my full list. Okay, I'm sorry, Liz Chiarello, who's associate professor at the Department of Sociology at St. Louis University. So these people are, so essentially the public health report, just like the education report, started with the historical, the legacy of poor funding for the health department, decades of poor funding, per capita expenditure that's for Missouri. I should give those. We gave those statistics. Missouri ranks dead last in terms of public health funding compared to Washington D.C., which has tenfold greater funding. And so, we do have poor outcomes, but those at least have an infrastructure to work on those and improve. And we commended that infrastructure that's actually focusing on those health outcomes, and it culminated in a report by the health department and the area hospitals 2 months ago. So there's going to be a considerable amount of data from that report inside the public health report, showing what the trends are in terms of adverse indicators for maternal child health, infant death, as well as access to care, and then talk about how we can remediate those things, and some of the natural recommendations should be full funding of the health department, consistent with guidelines from the national, state, territorial health departments. And along with that full funding, we have to ensure that we continue the citywide coordination of public health efforts. We have to engage our universities, Washington University and St. Louis University, in this, and have them have ownership in the public health problems in the city that may get better. As Washington University is creating a school of public health, they have actually a public health program, but a former school of public health was announced, and we actually have a dean who was hired recently, and marrying that effort with St. Louis University, and then bringing in the hospital partners. We cannot do public health in St. Louis without our hospital partners. So recommendations would be to follow up on the four, actually I say 6 indicators. Only 4 I'll highlight here. They were identified by this region-wide effort to address the disparities. First and foremost, maternal health, improving maternal health, and making sure we have appropriate resources using mid-level nursing, nurse practitioners, and others to really expand the scale of interventions. That's important. To address the mental health issues in St. Louis, we have a coalition, a behavioral health network here. But just like all the other things, it's just not well funded, and so we need to fund that public behavioral health network. And then violence, recognizing that violence is a public health threat. We have to ensure that that's fully incorporated in the um, um, public health department's core functions, and then have to ensure that there really is a full integration of those public health efforts at the health department with all the ongoing regional public health efforts that we are quite familiar with. And like all, make sure that there's requisite funding to accomplish all these things. So those are two reports, and those are informal recommendations. That's what we're going to discuss as a commission. But those are those two reports. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Ross. Just want to open it up for discussion on those two sections. Maybe we'll take it two sections at a time, to see if there are any comments from other commissioners on public health and education that should be noted as we delve into recommendations.
I think my feedback and questions are overarching across all areas, which is like, while certainly there's kind of like an architecture to what we have to build in order to deliver something, a set of recommendations that are actionable, potentially actionable in an ideal world, which is like one, definitely establishing the case that there are disparities that exist. I feel we have that. But then going deeper into what reparations are based upon race-based harms that are in that the reparations and those who pay out the reparations are liable, they're responsible for it. So right now what we've been charged with doing is looking at things within the city of St. Louis. And so I'm wondering is where we are going to show our assessment of what has been the race-based harm that's come up at the meetings, right? We've had guest speakers talk about very specific policies and actions at the hands of our government that have led to these disparities. So I'm concerned that if we don't put that in the report, that we are not delivering a cause of action.
Yeah.
As we say, like, let me finish.
Hmm.
As you know, basically that's what we lawyers say. You have to establish liability in order to be able to collect damages. And I don't know that what we have at this point. Like, that's what I'm looking for. Where is the nexus in the liability?
I heard you talk, Kayla.
Yeah, no, I think each section of the report takes on a different issue and has its own sort of understanding of history. So, for example, the two sections that I anchor that I'm happy to talk through where we are on the report. Um, really talk about the history of race-based policies and the shaping of the housing market in St. Louis that has resulted in the decreased wealth of Black families compared to white families in St. Louis, understanding that housing is sort of the foundational um, avenue to build wealth in this country. And so policies that prevented access to home ownership, um, policies that, decimated housing stock in predominantly Black communities in North City, um, things like the 1947 city plan and the sort of designed destruction of neighborhoods that were predominantly Black, whether that's where the Arch is now or a place like Mill Creek Valley, or, siphoned off neighborhoods like in College Hill, and Hyde Park that have been impacted by things like urban renewal. I think what we are trying to put together is a picture that inside of the city's policies that were layered on top of state and federal practices, decisions were made to divest from and prevent investment from going to predominantly Black neighborhoods that, overwhelmingly lowered the stock of housing, the quality of housing, um, and which in the way that we are proposing was a choice point because of race, and the result has racialized outcomes. And that when we talk about things again like the wealth of Black families in St. Louis compared to white families, the home ownership rates of Black families compared to a white family rates in St. Louis, the overarching uh, worth of homes in predominantly Black zip codes versus non-Black zip codes, and so on and so forth. And so I think each section is working to um, sort of land itself in what we are calling across sections like present day manifestations that really take that history and land it into a reality that argues this point that you're making, Kimberly, that there is a history of decisions locally by actors locally, both private and public sectors, that have resulted in racialized outcomes and race-based harms.
Yeah, and I think it's really important that in each, as we talk specifically about each area, how does that show up in, health? How does that show up in housing? What is the history in education? So, because there's going to be different policies and actions within each sector that we need to be very specific about. So, has that been dug into? Do we have the policy analysis?
I would comment that we have to present a prelude to the audience, to the viewers and the receivers, this report, that overall there should be a call, and there is a call for a National Reparations Commission. And we've talked, I know Professor Cunningham and I, along with um, all of us, this is not just the three of us. We've talked about Bill Darity's book on reparations, and how he states that reparations should not be, it cannot be a sole responsibility of a city or municipality. And Kayla, I think Professor Cunningham and I talked about taking Darity's book and sharing that with the commissioner so they can truly see that national perspective, and then realize that we're operating on a city charge by the mayor. And we have to, as you just said, Kayla, we have to give that national landscape, but state that, yes, we don't have those resources to do that at the national level. But we can look at those policies that are operative, that have perpetuated these harms at the city level, that we have done, we are doing, and we have done.
I have a question, and I apologize for being late to the meeting. So I missed the education overview, but from the report, it appeared to me that a lot of the policies are state level policies. And so to Commissioner Frank's point of us really noting what these policies are, I think that is extremely important also, that we really, because some of the recommendation has to be around how to approach that policy, those policies that are in place, right, for the system to change. Understanding that at the local level, the city level, there's only so much, but like for the education report, for example, there was so much stated that came from the state down. And so those policies, and even I made note of the pay for teachers, right? Again, we have so much to tackle policy-wise that I think we do have to highlight. We should highlight what these policies are that are preventing a lot of the movement, in addition to I think we should also recommend somewhere within this report that the conversation continues at a national level, because we do understand, as I'm sure a lot of people do, that it will be from a federal perspective that so much will take place. But for the policies that are affecting St. Louis, a lot of it is coming from the state level, but we should definitely highlight a lot of those policies because they're the reason why these things are the way that they are right now.
Well, let me just say, our charge was to study, make recommendations, and I think we should make recommendations, even if we understand, and of course that came out in a lot of the public comments as well, even if we understand that the city cannot, cannot really fund this. But we're going to make the recommendation anyway, regardless. I mean, that's not our job, is to figure out where the money comes from. To me, that's their job. Our job was to study, to make recommendations, to talk about the harms, the racial harms. Yeah, they came from the state, a lot came from the city and from the private sector. And that came out a lot, and going back over these, the public testimony, a lot of our audiences were very sharp. And that came out a lot too, that it's not just the state, it's not just the government, but also they worked hand in hand with the private sector. A lot of these housing policies were the result of policies by the private sector as well as the city and the state, and one influenced the other. So it's kind of hard to separate them. And so I think when we're talking about the harms, that's what we have to talk about. We have to talk about all of the harms, not just government policy, but everything that is responsible for the conditions that we see today.
And I feel like it's really important. We can spend a lot of time, you're going to have those who are the victims of something, of harm. And I feel like it's really important to really shine a spotlight on the bad actors. So it's basically like shame the devil and tell the truth. And so I would like to make sure that we are spending a little bit more time on that in our reports, highlighting, where the responsibility comes. We've been, it's been like, we spent probably about the past 10 years. We've had some really good reports come out about the disparities in the area. We've had the Ferguson report, had For the Sake of All. And so I think there's a keen awareness to the disparities that we're talking about, but we need to be hitting hard on the actions and putting a spotlight, like to your point, on there's some of the partnerships that have happened within the private sector that have supported by public policy and legislation and partnerships. And so, and at the end of the day, reparations is that the public sector stands guilty for race-based harms. And in order to basically create a package that is potentially, and I keep saying this, potentially actionable, we have to, and we want the legislative body to do something about it. It has to be delivered in a way that the legislative body sees ultimate responsibility.
You're both making salient, absolutely understandable and appropriate points. So yes, I see, Kayla, I see David's hand up.
Yeah, thank you. Can you hear me now? I can't see you, so I just want to make, okay,
yes,
great. Sorry I'm not able to be with you tonight, but I'm glad to be at least virtually in the room here. I appreciate all of these points here, and both thinking about very specific policies that both have created have caused the sorts of harms we've identified, but also can address those across each of the areas. But then also thinking about what it means to do this at a municipal level, and how that indicts actors at different levels, locally, at the state level, at the national level, and also when we think about public and private kinds of complicities as well. And just one thing I wanted to note along those lines, Dr. Ross mentioned William Darity's book, and the one in particular he's mentioning, I have it here. It's the Black Reparations Handbook that I'm guessing that many of you are familiar with, but this just came out recently, and this is a reparations working group. And the reason why I wanted to bring it up, at least at the outset of our conversation, is, first of all, they make a forceful argument that local reparations projects can be quite damaging if they don't sort of fully address the scale of harm, because if a national project flows from this, opponents can then say, well, reparations have already happened at the municipal level. This would be an argument against trying to have a more holistic national reparations program. So that's one thing. But the other thing that they know, and I feel like this is actually an advantage of our municipal level process, is, they certainly are interested in documenting harms, but they're also use a holistic indicator, and they say, well, we can try to address the scale of harms that have occurred, but we know that at minimum, the scale of those harms is equal to what it would require to eliminate the racial wealth gap. And so that is their estimate, is like what is required to eliminate the racial wealth gap. And what that really means too, though, is that they're not precisely estimating harms that stem from each of the kinds of areas that we are. And I think it seems important for us to figure out exactly where we stand there, especially as we think about intersections across our report areas. And one of those, I can talk later about the particular reports that I've been working with the groups for around jobs and economy and state violence. But the jobs and the economy one, just to take one example, I mean, one of the things as they move towards recommendations and think about policies are really centered on policies that have created residential segregation. So this is going to overlap very directly with our housing group and our neighborhoods group. And, I'm just wondering, as we talk, how we're going to think about each of our areas to be precise about what occurs within each area, but then also to recognize the intersections and the overlap, and to say, can it be that thinking about neighborhood level policies around residential segregation and disinvestment is actually a core cause of a bunch of the policies that we might see across areas, and kind of think about recommendations more holistically in that way? I'm not making a push strongly one way or the other, but it seems important to think about how much fidelity will create for each area versus thinking about what are really like the root or core kinds of policies that might be affecting, multiple or maybe all of these policy areas. So that seems to kind of intersect with how we might locate ourselves versus, say, the Darity group, which is really trying to argue against, in some ways, having these precise domain-specific policies, and instead to think about direct payments that are going to eliminate the racial wealth gap. And that becomes kind of the encompassing indicator or mode of, what reparations should look like. So just to note, the importance of at least locating ourselves alongside these other kinds of frameworks.
Yeah, David, that sounds like a nice segue into your two reports you oversaw.
Sure. Yeah, I can talk a little bit more about both of them. I already mentioned jobs and the economy.
Just before you
Oh, sure.
I think it would be good for the commission tonight to consider. So, I want to ground us back in that we sort of agreed some months ago that we would break ourselves into two working groups, and most of the commission sits inside of one of those working groups. Dr. Ross, David, and myself have taken on the charge of creating the sort of formal report, really thinking about sort of like owning and managing the creation of these subtopics, and then working with the other working group to sort of infuse personal testimony and personal experience and narratives into the sections of the report that have been written. So where we are now is sort of our offering back to the commission, so, sort of a flow chart that is going to come out of the working group to the full commission for feedback, edits, to the other working group for integration, back to the full group for another set of edits, back to the report working group to finalize, before one last pass as the full group and is made public. And so we really have been thinking about our function in this first sort of orientation of presenting the sections or getting the sections done, is to really focus on the sort of historic arc of these sections and some of the present day manifestations of those, knowing that the best way to sort of we could list out statistics that a Black family makes this much compared to um, a white family. A house in the 63107 zip code is different than the 63104 zip code, and and also that families have had to make decisions inside of those realities that are not statistical, but and that matters also. And so I wanted to say that to be like, we definitely are interested in responses. We are also are like holding a team of mostly policymakers and academics to sort of think about the edits to this and the conversations to this. So we want to definitely hear like report level feedback, but also the recommendations will not come from the three of us alone, and that actually is the charge of the entire commission. And I think we should consider David's proposal that we do not situate the recommendations inside of each section, but sort of let each section lead to a conclusion of recommendations that speak to the project of race-based harms more holistically, and not sort of confine ourselves to only responding to the fact or stat that's going to be listed inside the issue area, if that makes sense.
Very wise counsel.
I'll pass it back to you, Daisy.
No, I appreciate that, and it seems to be a productive way to think about what we have so far, and then how this will lead into the recommendations discussion. But in terms of what we have right now with the two sections that I was working with, is the jobs and the economy section was authored by Professor Adia Harvey Wingfield and Professor Jake Rosenfeld, who are both in sociology department at WashU, and Professor Ifeanyi Ukpapi, who is in a policy school at within UMSL. And they, have as you've seen, have a lot of historical detail. So the report really both works through a historical arc, thinking about economic trends over long periods of time, and how particular patterns of bias have kind of compounded some of the more structural features of the economy to disproportionately disadvantage Black residents of St. Louis and Black workers in St. Louis. And then they also think about more contemporary, and this is more, related to things like social networks, how people within organizations and employers interact with workers and things, and how these create kind of ongoing reproduction of these disadvantages. And so the report is kind of both tries to deal historically and in terms of ongoing harms in this case. And my point earlier about the intersection here, because in the report as it currently stands, there are two main recommendations, and one is around the city's role as being able to provide certain job creation in certain sectors of the economy, and that role being directed in a way that would explicitly try to address some of the inequities that have compounded over time. So one of their recommendations is really about the city's responsibility. The other one, though, as I was noting as an example earlier, is really about how much of these disadvantages that have reproduced over time is rooted in where people are located and the opportunities that are proximate to those locations. So thinking about residential segregation and the ways in which Black residents in St. Louis have been really barred from being proximate to certain areas of the city and certain opportunities that are located there become really important. So their other main, at least push towards a recommendation is largely about addressing those patterns as a way to then, at least indirectly or as a second order kind of thing, to move towards more economic equity in that sense. So that is one of the reports. The other report was quite different, both in terms of process and I think in terms of where it stands right now. And so this is the report on state violence. And the main people in that group are Professor Ashley Jackson, who's at Rutgers in criminal justice and at Rutgers, and Professor Andrea Boyles, who is in the sociology department at Tulane. And you may know Dr. Boyles has two books related to activism, politics, and inequality, and policing also in St. Louis. And so she is currently in New Orleans, but is from St. Louis and has spent much of her life here and done much of her work here. And I myself worked on that report as well. And what that report does, I think it overlaps some with the presentation I did some months back with the commission. And part of it is thinking about how the sustained patterns of police violence in St. Louis have, maybe three things. One is, how pronounced violence within perpetrated by police in St. Louis is relative to the national landscape. And you see there's a graph in the report that really places St. Louis on the top, meaning it has the highest levels of police perpetrated violence of any large metropolitan police department in the country. And so part of it is about the severity of St. Louis in that sense. And then the other part is really about how those actions and the tenor of policing is very highly patterned by neighborhood and by the racial composition of neighborhoods. And so there are several kind of graphs and maps in the report that seek to systematically document that pattern. I know this is not a new realization within our group or more generally, but the writers of the report really wanted to underscore that fairly systematically. And then the other thing the report tries to do is to think about the broader harms that has created, both within families that have been impacted by those who've been involved in the criminal legal system, but also in terms of neighborhoods where these patterns are most pronounced, the ways in which this affects trust in those neighborhoods, both trust of police and the criminal legal system, but also interpersonal trust. And so it tries to think more broadly about those kinds of harms. The main question, and I put this in as a marginal note in the report, for those of you who've seen that really came up here, is that the framing of this report is really centered on the criminal legal system in a more holistic way. So the intention was to deal with policing, to deal with courts, and to deal with jails as well. And in part because the group had most direct expertise in policing and so initiated that area first. But then as the report came together, the scale of the report was such that we had kind of filled space, our available space, if we want to think about our areas as being relatively even, with material on policing that's at least within the group was deemed to be really important to include. And so the question that flows from that, I think, are whether there should either be a significant paring down of the policing material to open up more space to talk about courts and jails, or I think a proposal was made afterwards to potentially, I think Dr. Ross mentioned this, to possibly think about actually creating a separate section. I know there's been some maneuvering, maybe when Kayla speaks after this, there might be some maneuvering in the kind of boundaries of our areas here, but just to put that out as a question now that I think remains an open question and I know needs to be addressed fairly quickly, especially if another report section needs to be drafted and to remain on our timetable. So that's kind of the current state of the working groups and the reports that you have in front of you now.
Any questions or feedback on David's sections around the economy or state violence?
Um, so when you talking about making room for analysis of courts and jails, are there disparities there? That I think, like, certainly if it's there, right, and it's pertinent to our charge, why not put it out there? If it's there and it's part of, it feeds into the recommendations, it seems that it behooves us to provide that detail. So is this like a space thing, or is this a matter whether you think it's relevant?
I think it's the former. I mean, I think it's clear that there are going to be disparities there that should be discussed. And, I think what happened is this area is, like, encompasses so much that is important to discuss carefully, but also, maybe has a broader purview than some of our other areas. And so it's a space thing. And I know at some level that seems like a minor consideration, because if it's important, of course, we would want it in the report. But so even if we do agree that these are aspects that should be included, it would be helpful to think about how we should do that, so the report, looks like we're treating with roughly commensurate detail and care each of these areas. And so whether that should mean a separate section that's of similar length, or, maybe some of you read this and thought, well, there's a lot of, some of these maps and graphs and things that are taking up a lot of the policing space, or particular aspects of the discussion might seem less primary. I think the group would be open to feedback around restructuring the policing discussion to open up more space within the section. So but to answer your question, I think the issue really is about the scope of our discussion rather than the import of these areas, because clearly, through kind of every stage of the court system, I mean, we're going to see disparities that are going to be reproduced at each of those stages, and Black residents have been disproportionately impacted by all of the things that we know have been really substandard and traumatizing about certainly the workhouse before it was closed, and the City Justice Center as well.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's gonna be records there. That's one of those things where there's gonna be records. What I just read the other day, 30% of Black males will be arrested by the time they're 18. 50% by the time they're 24. And the courts, in those court hearings that are a matter of public record, make or break that situation. So I'm not looking at this as I know as academicians, you all are really experts about how to present information, so not to overload. So I'm not coming at it as a academician, but I also respect and understand the underlying concerns in terms of information overload and keeping everything going. But I just think if it's pertinent,
It's highly pertinent, highly relevant.
Yeah,
it
should be included.
Part of the
Yeah.
Yes.
Awesome. Yeah, thanks for the feedback on that. I can very quickly go over my sections or more into it, because I sort of did give an overview. So, we are in the process of we have a draft of the housing section. We have robust direction in the neighborhood section, and the two groups are trying to rectify if it sort of makes sense to merge these two sections into one section, knowing that in order to have a robust conversation about neighborhoods, you have to talk about housing, and to have in the St. Louis context, to talk about housing, you sort of have to talk about neighborhoods, and both looking at, again, this this fine line that we're having to walk between sort of federal programs that had local impact, like things like urban renewal and the construction of highways in St. Louis, but also local policies that were passed and advocated for that greenlit the sort of removal of entire neighborhoods and communities, and budgetary decisions that were guided by strategies that lends itself to the divestment of resources from North City, St. Louis. And so I so the working group is still very much um, trying to work into as many examples as possible, thinking about a few neighborhoods, and then also sort of structural um, instances of closure and removal that impact a neighborhood, something like the closure of a hospital in North City or a medical center in North City, and how that impacts the neighborhood around it. Um, and also just neighborhoods that have been, you know, decimated through choice points that range again from sort of a national planning over the course of, the construction of Highway 70, 44, and 55, and 64, and then the implementation of sort of a revitalization project that has resulted in neighborhoods being divested, and then removed, and what the consequences of those are as they relate to um, the wealth gap that we know is really fundamentally connected to housing in our communities, access to loans and other resources by the private sector to increase home ownership, um, and then the sort of process of determining the value of properties in predominantly Black communities that has contributed to a disparity in, similarly structured homes in a place like Shaw versus a place like Hyde Park, but you know massive disparity between how much those homes are considered to be worth. Um, and so, again, we sort of arrived at this point in part because one working group was a little more dormant than the other. And then once we got the notes from that group, it really read as if it would make sense to create sort of a larger section that was housing and neighborhoods to tell a more intertwined story between the process of home ownership and housing, and connecting it to sort of neighborhood design, investment, and structure and governance.
Oh, that makes perfect sense to me. I think that we're talking about the need for policy. I think this area lends itself to a policy analysis more than any of the other areas. This really
Mhm.
follows suit to have that integration of neighborhood housing.
Yep. Municipal governments receive federal funding, and then they decide on a policy about how they're going to administer that funding. That's what's going on right now. Right now, federal funding is being used to invest in underserved communities, but St. Louis has a reputation of in the past using that federal funding, to your point, of divesting or not investing or disproportionately investing in predominantly white communities to the disadvantage of Black communities. So there have been intentional decisions that have been made along those lines, which is where we are now. So even if we talk about the nexus to federal funding, we make decisions as a city about how we're going to do that. And so there's been major touch points in St. Louis's urban development strategy that we can touch upon. What did they call it? What was that plan that they had under, what was it?
Plan 4?
Yes,
Team
that
Four
one.
Plan.
Yeah, Plan 4.
Mm-hmm.
Back in this,
Yeah,
Team
Team
4,
Four.
back in the
Yeah,
70s.
Team Four.
Team 4, yes.
So
Mm-hmm.
yeah, so we talk about that as something that's not like formally adopted by the city, but implemented nonetheless
Mm-hmm.
in budgetary and policy driven decisions, and thinking about neighborhoods like Darst Webb, Cochrane Gardens, Mill Creek, DeSoto Carr, and the long term implication of the lack of program, the lack of resources, the lack of investment, the sort of reliance or the the choice to not sort of manage and hold accountable landlords that allowed properties to, overwhelmingly fall apart in certain neighborhoods versus certain neighborhoods in North City versus certain neighborhoods in South City, knowing that Black residents are more likely to rent than own inside the city because of these long-term restrictive covenants and pathways to home ownerships being very limited. And so we both have to so essentially what we're trying to do and what I'm painting is like we sort of have two documents right now. One is really thinking about neighborhoods and trying to connect the story of federal to the sort of local cause, and then one that really did focus on sort of housing and the practices of the public and private sector, both federally and locally. We're having to take those two documents and make them talk to each other to sort of tell a more full story, because absent that combination, both are missing an element that paints a picture, because they're trying to carve out not talking too much about housing in one space, not talking too much about neighborhoods in one space. And so I think we are in sort of a redirection moment to create a more structured section.
Agree.
Any other thoughts on like housing and neighborhoods? I'm especially interested, Ms. Gwen, in how you um, in sending this to you sooner than later as we sort of reconcile these two sections, knowing that you were our speaker on the issue when we were having sort of expert testimony and presentation to the public. So just interested in like how you are hearing that sort of overview of those sections.
Yeah, well, this is something I've been even looking at even deeper since I've been doing, looking more at at urban renewal and how that neighborhood was destroyed. And it was so profound. And the more I research it, I understand how destructive it was. One of them was businesses. A lot of Black businesses were destroyed. We usually don't talk about that. We talk about the housing, that people were displaced, but businesses were displaced. A lot of Black businesses was displaced. That destroyed wealth. I have specific instances where wealth was destroyed because of that. It happened over and over and over again. And I'm really, really focusing a lot on the private sector too, because the private sector was, I always say if there's any villains in this story, it's the real estate industry too, which we don't look at closely enough. I think we do, but we always focus on public policy, what the city is doing, what the government is doing. But it's not like they were separate entities. They were working hand in glove together. And I just don't want to me, I just don't want to look at what the government did, what the city did, because the city didn't do that in isolation. The city was working, they were heavily influenced by the private sector.
Yeah, and the private sector,
their fingerprints are all over this.
And the private sector was like uniquely organized inside of structures like Civic Progress and other
Civic
sort of
Progress,
entities.
when you talk about the real estate industry and like restrictive covenants, they wrote a lot, they were responsible for a lot of that. They funded a lot of that. They put that, they were responsible for that segregation ordinance. So, I know we focus a lot on public policy, we focus a lot on government, city, the state, the federal, but it can't be separate from what the private sector was doing. They had a heavy hand, a very heavy hand. We live in a capitalist society.
Well, the city was chartered off of a private-public partnership. The Lewis and Clark Expedition, that was commissioned by, by the monarchy to go get land. And so, like, if you go down to the Arch Museum and you look at the timeline, Civic Progress is a descendant of that. So it's always been public-private partnerships between cities and developers. But the policies support and enable and give privilege to the capitalist private partners.
In the government's,
Right.
the manual that they use to redline was written by the real estate industry. So, I mean, they relied on the real estate industry a lot because they were the person, they were supposedly have the expertise. So you relied on the people with the expertise, and they influenced a lot of government policy. And I don't know if I'm responding to what you were asking, but
I think that that's a important sort of nuance that we need to, because we do focus on sort of federal actors and we do sort of focus on local policies, but the sort of bridge from one to the other often is through this sort of private sector relationship. So bonds, propositions that have to get passed to make budgetary investments or divestment and decisions about neighborhoods and communities. How people even learn to vote on them is it activates the private sector to sort of infiltrate the conversation toward their desired outcome and necessarily at the behest of what the community needs. So I think it's an important point of feedback that we need to figure out. And the more I think each of us, the three of us, sort of think about these reports, is like, in order to do that robustly, it just does take more space, and we were trying to confine ourselves to a smaller section, especially asking people to volunteer their time toward contributing to the drafting of it outside of the commission members. And so I do think that's part of what like both David and I are sort of living inside of the tension. Sort of each time we need to tell that story and arc that narrative to make a picture more clear, we're sort of lengthening the section, and we wanted to both be comprehensive and also accessible inside of what their entire books on the issue of housing in St. Louis. And so we don't want to duplicate what has been done already. We want to we want to give people those resources to read and further their learning, and sort of think about the report as both specific, but also sort of in an overview manner, so that we're not, and that's a fine line to walk.
Yeah, I got.
Any other questions for me about the housing neighborhood section?
No, I agree with everything you just said about all the integration. I was just commenting on, our first charge when we came together. We were told we don't need, a 500-page report. We don't want to read a 500-page report. We know what's happening in St. Louis. Condense it, give us a synopsis, and see how that will translate into policy change that will result in significant improvement in the lives of Black Americans in this city. From day one, that was our charge. And I think that we're showing fidelity to that charge.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely.
Yes, ma'am. We have
It's not a-
Just,
do have a
just to, oh, I'm
someone
sorry, just
speaking.
to, okay, just to make a quick point as well that I think builds on, oh, I'm sorry.
Someone's talking in the room, David.
You were asking how does this all link to? Yes, ma'am. Absolutely, and that means that you start off, start the reparations report with that statement. So yes, you don't bury that, of course.
Yeah, I think that we didn't hear that comment in the room, but also want to say that one part of the report that we haven't talked about because it doesn't actually situate itself under the umbrella of an issue area is sort of telling the story of like enslavement as the original race-based harm that sets the foundation for these policies, practices, and procedures to sort of manifest and be built. And so that is also a section of the report. And I think we focused on the issues and thinking about the recommendations, but the recommendations also have to respond to the reality of enslavement and sort of inhumane policies and procedures that limited the movement freedoms of Black folks in this region.
I was going to know, I didn't hear the comment in the room either, but I was going to say a very similar thing just to note it, especially as we think about the sections we've talked about here. But that section on enslavement, which is fairly far along, it's still in draft form and not a full narrative now. But just to note, and this follows, I think, exactly from what Kayla was saying, the way that section's structured it has a general discussion, but then it also feeds into each of our 6 areas and shows how the foundations for the inequities that we see in each of those areas were laid within a system of enslavement. And another theme that's quite pronounced there, I think, really builds on the point that Gwen was making about thinking about how private actors and state entities were really working very consistently with each other, and relying on each other to build up those systems. And so I think that point as well is underscored quite strongly in the enslavement in St. Louis section that we'll be able to present to you all before our next meeting.
Yeah, so just as like I think we're going to be sort of, it's July 22nd. We got to deliver this report in less than 60 days. And so we are, up against the clock, and also understanding that the commission and all of the members and some of them are not here tonight, need to sit with the sort of each section more robustly. And also, there is a conversation about and I think we maybe need to just like sort of each speak to our thinking on this. Is that I think sort of originally we were thinking about situating the recommendations inside of the issue area sections, and now there is a proposal to sort of tell the story in the sections and then sort of have a its own standalone section of recommendations that overarch, inclusive of specific issue components, but also make space for the things that thread the intersectionality or intersections of the different areas that we are speaking to in the report. I feel in alignment with that change. I'm going to test that to the fuller commission.
I'm in alignment with that also.
I think we would need to vote on it. Put that to a motion to vote on it.
It wasn't a previous motion. It's not. I don't know if we need to vote more so than. I mean, I guess it's a vote if people. Yeah. Okay, we can vote on it. I'll make the motion that we change the recommendations will be a standalone section of the report.
I second that.
Okay. Any objections to that proposal? Okay, so hearing there are none, we have agreed that that will be how we land the recommendations in the report. I owe my section to the full commission, and we'll get that to you as soon as possible. And also, I think it is, we are going to be sort of in conversation inside of our working group. I would also encourage the other working group to be thinking about what recommendations they want to be submitting. And we can do this across, both our meetings and through, non-meeting communication. But I think it's really imperative that we're really taking the next 2 weeks I would give us to have recommendations set from the entire commission. And so if once you read them, it doesn't need to be perfect language. It doesn't need to be written in, sort of complete sentences. But if there are just like, if each commission member could on our thread um, or just to me directly send over your thoughts on recommendations. That way we can put together the draft and then submit it to the full commission for feedback and approval. I think that would help our working group, which is still holding the feedback that we got tonight to update the sections. So this recommendation part really does have to be a collaborative effort. Are there any questions or thoughts from any members of the commission before we get ready to close, I think?
Well, I do have a question. We've been working on public comments, testimony. How is that going to be integrated into the final report?
Yeah, so I think if are they organized by section or like issue area, or is it just sort of a
Issue area.
issue area? Yeah, so I think if we can get our hands on those, um, that we could work to like integrate them into the sections.
Okay.
Great question.
Okay.
Oh, great. Yeah. Good feedback from everyone.
Yeah, robust conversation. Well, I send love from Pennsylvania, and appreciate folks making space for an in-person conversation, and we will be in touch with next steps.
Okay. Okay.
Motion to adjourn.
I move adjournment.
Second.
All in
So
favor?
move.
Okay. Aye.
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 We stand adjourned.
Thank you all. Have a great evening. Be safe.
See ya.
Thank you.
Thanks all.
Bye.